Hello, everyone. I'm here with um, Associate Professor at the University of Massachusetts, Chun, from the US, who will be joining us today. Um, Christian's work sits at the intersection of critical discourse analysis, language education, and social justice. And he has a strong focus on how English functions as a gatekeeper in academic and professional settings. What makes Christian's work particularly relevant for us is his commitment to reframing academic language teaching, not just as a technical or skills-based activity, but as a deeply social, political, and ethical one. He challenges us to think critically about how or whose knowledge counts, whose language practices are legitimized, and how we as teachers can support our students to navigate and question these power structures. Some of these publications include Power and Meaning Making in an EAP Classroom, Engaging with the Everyday, and numerous articles that have influenced how many of us think about critical pedagogy in EAP. Thank you very much for joining us today. We are at Queen Mary University of London today, not online. And I want to start with the first question. So how has your interest in EAP and literacy development emerged and developed in general? How did you end up in EAP?
Right. So how I ended up in EAP was an interesting journey because when I left my hometown of New York to move to Los Angeles, after a couple of years of working at other jobs, I kind of basically fell into being an English as an additional language teacher. And I had no background in it because my undergraduate majors was not in applied linguistics. And the school that hired me, they just hired me because I was the so-called native speaker of English and I had a university degree. So when I was starting, and I've written about this, but I'll mention this again. So when I started teaching, they assigned me to teach the grammar courses. And in the advanced grammar courses, there were a few notable times when my students were the ones who were correcting me when I chose the wrong answer in the Betty Azar grammar book. And so that was my introduction of so-called native speakerism versus non-native speakerism. I was like, oh, okay. And then also I've written about this where following the 1992 uprisings in Los Angeles because of the Rodney King verdict, where many of the students were expressing outrage, the students primarily from Korea. They were expressing outrage of the anger directed against them by the Latine and African-American communities in Los Angeles. And I had to introduce the whole historical backgrounds and why Black people in the U.S. were angry about the Rodney King verdict. And so that was the introduction to kind of a critical approach going beyond the standardized curriculum.
Yeah, on that. Okay, now we're going to move to the actual first question. So how's your own professional journey influenced the way in which you support EAP teachers in developing a critical perspective on language literacy?
Right. So I got my PhD relatively late in my life. I mean, I finished it in 2010, and that was after, again, teaching for many years in the English language classroom. And so when I started teaching at the graduate level, it was the first university was University of Southern California, and many of the students were in-service teachers based not only in the U.S. but around the world, teaching English as an additional language. And so there was this it was interesting because they brought in all the different contexts in which English language was being taught. So it was going beyond the boundaries of the U.S. and that how, of course, some of the students, they felt pressured by their particular schools in which they could not really go beyond the standardized curriculum. Yeah. And so this is kind of how I started thinking about, all right, how do we actually engage with the course materials, but in ways in which would not jeopardize the teacher's job in terms of being punished by administrators or even maybe by one or two students who might be complaining about why aren't they teaching me just what I need to know.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, that's very interesting because yes, normally there's the pressure also falls on the teachers. We may ask them to be more critical, but then if there are constraints, then basically they're not going to be able to do much. Which actually leads us to the second question. What challenges do you think EAP teachers face when trying to incorporate more critical perspectives into the practice of language education?
Right. So following on that, what I've been addressing in my graduate classes with my students who are in-service teachers and pre-service teachers is that what I've been calling of a kind of underground or subtle approach to it. And so on one particular front, as you know, in terms of English grammar, I address like, okay, when you're, addressing like, for example, the passive voice, and bring up some examples of why and how the passive voice is used. And so one of the examples I give is that in terms of when in the U.S. history textbooks, for example, when they write about the bombing of Hiroshima in Japan during World War II, they always write it in the passive voice. Whereas when they refer to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, they always write it in the active voice. And so I say, so then just address and have the students think about why is the passive voice versus the active voice being used, and in what context, and with which agents or people with that. So that's just,
And what challenges do you see, like from a more institutional perspective, in terms of what constraints are there for teachers to try and implement these more critical views?
What sort of constraints?
The constraints. Thinking of, for example, the more neoliberal university,
right?
How that sort of limits what you can do sometimes.
Right. So I would say that, again, building on that, to have teachers get into a dialogue with their administrators in terms of bringing in alternative lesson plans, and just, I would say, frame it in a way that says, the critical thinking is fundamental to academic skills, because when these students are going to either undergraduate or graduate studies, to have them think critically, because when the particular if they're taking courses, and if they're planning to take courses in the social sciences or humanities fields, that some of their courses, their professors will be requiring a critical perspective, not just the banking model of just reproducing it, so that these critical thinking skills will actually help these students to succeed better in the academic world. And this is something that, of course, maybe the administrators would be aware of, but just to kind of remind them in a way that this is not just the fostering this kind of quote unquote propaganda or
Okay, the next question is, from your experience, what kinds of reflective practices or training activities can help EAP practitioners to critically interrogate dominant discourses in academic language teaching?
All right. So one of the issues that there's several issues that are interrelated, but one of them is that where what Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa have been addressing, as well as other scholars, this term racial linguistics, of how the use of this particular class, in this case upper class, upper middle class, standardized American English, which is white, what they argue perpetuating the whiteness. So in other words, if you don't sound like this upper class white person, then your English is being denigrated. Okay. And so in terms of not just speaking, but also of writing. And one of the things that's interesting, because now that in the context of the US, now that I have tenure, where recently my publications, I've been not using the academic register in my publications. I've been writing in much more of what I want to be much more of this everyday accessible English, to kind of go beyond academia. And I think this is also something that in terms of the practitioners, to have them to think about, in terms of like, well, how do we actually reconstruct and deconstruct academic registers, so that the language, in terms of how we convey ideas would not just be confined within a certain class and racialized spaces, but that the students are not going to be inadvertently or unconsciously, subconsciously, perpetuating that kind of supremacy.
Yeah, I see. I see some challenge there though sometimes because I feel like, or at least in the UK, very often we work in some sort of third space within the university where we may sort of encourage the students to adopt registers that are not necessarily complying with the formal accepted. But then normally they are marked by lecturers in other departments who may not have a linguistic awareness as we do, and therefore we can only sort of advise question. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I totally understand. I totally agree. And again, this is going to be a necessary part of the larger dialogue to engage with people from outside our discipline to make them aware of that, because yes, most of them are unaware of that, and so that's why.
No, I see. I remember when I did my PhD, I had classmates who there's a very famous scholar, I'm not a name, but that very famous scholar in education, not in linguistics, but in education, was advising some of my classmates to go and find a native speaker to sort of look at the ongoing chapters of the thesis. So that's a sort of fight, battle, or struggle, challenge that I'm sort of talking about.
Right.
Even when, I'm talking to someone who is very critical about education, but then when it comes to language,
right,
not very aware of how he may have been perpetuating some sort of injustices, so to speak.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Is that common in the US as well?
Oh, yes. There's been a lot of discussions and debates about that, and going beyond academia, activists on the left, where, in terms of it reminds me of the famous quote by the great Black Panther leader, the great Black Panther Party leader, Fred Hampton, when he said, "Theory's cool, but theory with no practice ain't crap." I'm just using the last word, but So he nailed it, because again, it's okay, great theory, but if you're not actually in terms of people fighting for social justice and as you said, the critical education, but if it's not actually in real life practice, then what's
exactly.
What good is it?
Yeah, exactly. What good is it? Yeah, so interesting. Okay, next question. In what ways can teacher development programs encourage EAP instructors to see themselves not only as language teachers, but also as facilitators of social justice and critical engagement?
Right, and that's another really good question. So this is one of the issues that I address in the core courses, one of the core courses I teach at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. It's called Language, Culture, and Identity. And I attempt to have my students, again, many of them are in-service teachers, to interrogate their own self-identities and think about in terms of how their identities and the cultures they identify, how that has shaped not only the ways in which they view themselves, but of course the ways in which they view their students. And I think this is important, because part of that is that the so-called model minority myth, and where if they have students from countries, particularly like East Asia, or like whether it's Japan or Korea or China, where they're just always expecting those students to be, quote unquote, the good student, and whereas other students from other regions, as they're kind of, I don't want to say looked down upon, but they're not valued as much. So I think this is important, where these teachers need to be thinking about, again, how the ideologies are intertwined with their identities and cultures and their perceptions, where they just don't even really have, critically reflected on. So I think that's.
And I'm just wondering, how someone becomes an EAP teacher at a US university is I'm not sure if it will be too different from how it is here, but normally the more or less traditional journey would be EFL, and then start navigating EAP, and then maybe do a master's degree. And in that master's degree, you may have an EAP component which is not compulsory, which is normally optional. And many EAP practitioners may not sort of take it and then still end up, working in EAP. So how do you think we can bring in this sort of anchor these critical perspectives into, in teacher education so that they do not become just a sort of additional component that some of them may not take or opt out of? You know what I mean?
Yes, yes.
So,
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, yeah, it should be fundamental to all language teaching. So regardless of it's English or, if the students are planning to teach other languages, it's connected with all languages.
Yeah.
But I would argue primarily the languages of colonial heritage, whether it's French, Spanish, of course, English, but that how yes, I think it should be incorporated in the broader area of education departments.
Because when you think, for example, MMA TESOL, the core modules will be SLA,
Right.
the teaching methods,
Right.
those tend to be, and then like social linguistics, sometimes it's an optional one,
Right.
an optional one, and then we tend to focus more on perhaps the most sort of critical thing that you can see in the methods modules are sort of the post methods and that sort of thing. And then many students are left without any actual contact with, or without access to that sort of information or knowledge that is there, and maybe should have a core module instead of. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just have one brief comment on that. I mean, I find it, to be honest, a kind of ironic that when you mention SLA, and this is something I have talked with my doctoral students, I said, the irony of using that word acquisition.
Yeah.
So it's actually, the everyday meaning of that is to purchase. So what are you actually purchasing, buying? Shouldn't we, as applied linguists, kind of reconsider not using that term?
So interesting. Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, next question. We only have two more questions.
Sure.
Look, can you share some examples of how you've worked with the EAP teachers to design or adapt materials that center critical topics such as race, equality, or power relations in academic context?
Right. So one of the assignments that I've been doing, having the students do, is to create a lesson plan. So even for those students who are not currently teaching, but to have them think about how to design a lesson plan that would be using a critical approach. Mm-hmm. And so, it's very broad in terms of like multimodality. So it doesn't have to be necessarily focused just on the language, but of course, in terms of images, how it interconnects, of course, with language. Mm-hmm. So that's one part with the lesson plan. And the other thing is that to have them, again, go beyond the classroom, and so have that thinking about in terms of maybe the students thinking about how media, because of course now everyone's addicted to social media, how social media is also perpetuating certain ideologies interconnected with language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good. Thanks. And to finish, we do have time though. What do you see as the most pressing priorities for the future of the EAP? We want to move towards a more inclusive model of education.
That's really an important question, and there's a lot to unpack. So there's several, if you want to say several layers of that or several fronts, but one is that, what I've addressed in that book that you mentioned, Power and Meaning Making. I mean, in terms of how the student EAP going, teachers, practitioners, becoming aware of the discourses, the embedded discourses in the standardized curriculum materials, but also, again, in terms of how thinking about how we can address the issue of English as an academic language, and have them again, converse with not just their fellow co-teachers, but people outside their field. So I think this is something on various fronts, and I know it's a lot to unpack and a lot to decipher. But I mean, I think that it's important when with the with everything that's going on in this world, around the world, I think it's important to have conversations with people in the classrooms who are around the world. And so how we can feel that we have to build a community of understanding and love and kindness for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I would like to sort of can you elaborate on this idea of conversing with others? And I think even within education, sometimes we've forgotten to converse with some fields, disciplines that have a lot to say about education, say sociology, ecology, social studies, whatnot. What are your thoughts on sometimes teacher education programs moving away from those sort of stop sort of having a dialogue with them and focusing mostly on applied linguistics or like this sort of field rather than looking at what others have to say as well.
Yeah, that's a really, again, really important question. And I think that, I mean, if it's possible to have these programs, to have one of the either electives or maybe even a core course in the other fields that you mentioned, like whether it's urban studies or sociology, and like linguistic anthropology, of course, where, I mean, to have the grad students or undergrads take at least one or two courses in those other disciplines to have them introduced to it.
The so-called fundamentals of education, I think
right?
It's called in the past, like sociology of education,
right?
Psychology of education, so on.
Yes.
Because there's this sort of focus on trying to be sort of more practical, or like trying to taking teacher education programs not away, but sort of spending considerable time in practice, which is not bad in itself, but sometimes that's at the expense of giving student teachers an opportunity to learn or to situate the activity of educating within the sort of broader sociological or societal sort of field.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you like to say anything else about teacher development or?
I think I covered everything, but thank you again for inviting me for this interview. It was quite an honor to accept.
Thank you for coming all the way to Queen Mary. We are not online. This is in Queen Mary, in the East End of London. Okay. Thank you, Christine, again for giving us this interview.